Welcome back to Mastering 3D in Photoshop. My name is Kirk Nelson, and we are now on Chapter 2 of the course, in which we will construct a 3D planet. This is lesson number 8, where we will take a closer look at the mesh presets. In previous lessons, we showed how to add meshes to Photoshop by importing them as models from other programs, and we also showed how to create meshes by extruding paths in 3D text. In this lesson, we'll talk about how to use the meshes that are native to Photoshop, and that is what's known as the mesh presets. So I'm going to start here with this layer that's filled with a base checkerboard texture. Something to note is that whenever you add a 3D mesh to Photoshop, it will use whatever layer you're currently on. It doesn't add a new layer when you do this. So whatever you have on that layer will be transferred to the 3D object. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If we go to the 3D panel, because notice I'm in the 3D workspace, we get Create New 3D Object here. The source is Selected Layer, which can be changed to either Work Path, Current Selection, or File. It defaults to Selected Layer, so we'll just keep it there. Now the first option is a 3D postcard, and we just click the Create button. It transforms that layer with this texture on it into a very flat plane, which it calls a postcard. So if we go into our 3D view and start moving that around, you can see we can toggle and spin and manipulate that layer as if it were actually a 3D object, which is really what it is now. That's what Photoshop means by a 3D postcard. Now, while that postcard sits on its own category, I primarily want to focus on the meshes from preset, which is this third category here. Now, the second category, 3D extrusion, is what we dealt with the 3D text. But the meshes from preset is where we have this drop down of various different types of shapes that can be formed from that layer. So we'll start with just the cone because it's at the top of the list. We hit create, and Photoshop generates a cone based on that texture that's on that layer. Notice how the texture is being applied to the cone though. It's being wrapped around so that the top of it gets pinched. Those squares are much smaller up there as opposed to the squares at the bottom, which are even stretched out to be more rectangular this way. The squares that actually look like squares in the normal are about midway up the cone. So just as an item of reference, I've gone through and created each of those mesh presets, and I'll just quickly go through and show you how they look when you apply a basic texture to them. And I want you to take note of how that texture is applied and how the texture gets stretched and squashed and skewed around to fit on these 3D objects. Some of them are fairly basic, like the cone, and you'd expect a cube. Notice that the texture is only on one face of that cube. It's not on all 6 faces. It only ends up on one. When you create a cube, you end up having 6 different textures that you can add to it, which is rather convenient, especially if you want them all to be totally different, but it can be confusing if you're expecting your texture to wrap completely around that. In fact, if that's what you're expecting, you'd want to use the cube wrap, which is what happens there. It uses one single material to go completely around that cube. Otherwise, we also have the expected things like the cylinder. Notice again, the texture goes around the outside of that cylinder. It does not map to the end caps, but there are materials already assigned to those that you can map to it. There's the sphere, which is probably one of the most common elements that gets added this way. Again, notice how that the texture is stretched across the equator and pinched at the poles. We have the pyramid that does a similar thing to the cube in that you get a material for each of the faces. And then we get several objects that are very odd as far as why they're in here as a preset object, but you may find yourself needing to use them or finding interesting situations in which they might be useful to you. For instance, the soda can. Not sure why that's a preset, but it is. The ring is actually fairly helpful, but it's a ring that looks like it would go on your finger. It's not the type of ring that you would expect to be completely circular around its girth here. It is flattened and looks like something that you could actually wear as jewelry. And of course, if you're accessorizing, we gotta have a hat. Yes, there is a hat preset because we use hats in 3D art so frequently. The donut, which is often called a torus in other 3D programs, is actually a fairly useful shape. This is what I would expect with the ring preset actually. Now this would be even more useful if you could have a little more control over the diameter of the circle that's being revolved. Alas, that's not the case. And of course, we have a wine bottle that even has a glass attribute already assigned to it. By default, it takes that texture we had and wraps it around as the label. Why they put so much effort into a preset mesh, I'm thinking it's only here just so that you can learn how to use the 3D tools. I honestly don't see why we would need to have this as a preset shape for a 3D object within here. I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson that there's several ways to create these 3D objects, and I only showed you the one. I showed you the one that's on the 3D panel if there's no 3D layer selected. If you select a 3D layer and go to the 3D panel, you get those properties. If you select a 2D layer and go to the 3D panel, that's where you get the Create New 3D Object menu. You can also create them from the 3D menu at the top of the application, New Mesh from Layer. There's a mesh presets there that lists all of the different presets we've already explored. Also, if you're within a 3D scene already, at the footer of the 3D panel, there's a new meshes icon, which allows you to now add new elements here. When you do this, it does not use the current layer or a texture. It comes in with a blank texture that then you add to. Now, the promise of this project is that we would be creating a planet, and so far we haven't. So far we've just explored the library of different shapes we can use, and we don't intend to create a wine bottle shaped planet, do we? No, we need to create a spherical planet. So let's do that now. We've got our background layer. We don't want to use that. Let's create a blank layer. Now the layer doesn't even need to have anything on it. It can be completely and entirely blank and still be used to create a mesh preset. Mesh from preset, sphere, create. There's our planet. That was easy. No, we're going to go a little bit further than that even. So let's grab this sphere and scale it up some. Now, in planning through this, and because I've done a couple of planets before, I find it's often handy to have a couple of different spheres in here. In particular, I like to have one sphere that is the ground planes, or the ground elements of the planet, and another sphere that's slightly larger than that to contain the atmosphere elements of it. Let's do that. I've got the main sphere mesh selected over here, and I'm going to right click and say duplicate objects. Notice there's an instance objects too, and what that does is creates a duplicate of it that is still linked back to the original. So any changes you make to the original object, those changes will subsequently pass on to the instances. That's not what we want here. We want to duplicate. And on this sphere 1 duplicate, let's go to our mesh and look at the scale values. Now we can scale it by the toggle on here, but a lot of times I like to use the coordinates panel just to make sure we dial it in and it's very close to the original one, but still large enough to be seen. In this case, it's 10.96. That's the original sizing. We'll pull all of this up to 11. So now I know that sphere is just slightly larger than the other one, and it will retain that value if I select both of them and scale them both up at the same time. That's the mesh presets. Now we know how to add native 3D objects to Photoshop. In our next lesson, we'll start texturing them. So we'll make these big gray spheres that are floating in space something that actually looks like a planet.